The sun dipped low over the quiet suburban neighborhood, casting golden hues over the neat rows of houses that all looked the same, except for one. Tucked at the very end of the cul-de-sac, standing in defiant contrast to the manicured lawns and cookie-cutter perfection, was Frank's land. It wasn't just any patch of earth. It was his, a sanctuary of wildflowers swaying in the breeze, a small pond where birds sang at dawn, and a hand-built wooden bench where he and his late wife Eleanor once sat for hours, dreaming of the life they'd build together. Frank, a retired veteran in his 60s, had spent his life fighting for his country. But he never thought he'd have to fight for the very land beneath his feet, especially not against his own neighbors. Yet that was exactly what was about to happen. It started subtly, like a slow-moving storm on the horizon. A knock at the door, an official-looking letter slipped into his mailbox, the polite but firm words of a woman with a clipboard. The HOA, newly formed and led by a ruthless, power-hungry president named Karen, had decided Frank's land was a problem. It didn't match the strict aesthetic they envisioned. "It's an eyesore," they told him. "It's devaluing the neighborhood." But Frank knew the truth. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. Karen and her board saw an opportunity. They wanted his land, not because it was ugly, but because it was valuable. Frank's heart tightened as he held the letter in his weathered hands, scanning the cold, bureaucratic words that sliced through him like a blade. They were demanding he clear the land, immediately, or face fines. If he refused, they threatened legal action. It was his land, his and Eleanor's. No HOA had the right to tell him what to do with it. He had never signed any agreement, never consented to be governed by their arbitrary rules. The audacity of it all sent fire through his veins, but he kept his voice steady when he called their office. "This land belonged to my wife," he told Karen when she answered. "I won't be getting rid of it." There was a pause. Smug chuckle. Then Karen's voice, sickly sweet but laced with thinly veiled condescension. "Oh, Frank, you'll come to see things our way. One way or another." Frank didn't like the way she said that. The battle lines had been drawn, and the war escalated faster than he ever imagined. At first, it was just petty harassment, letters piling up in his mailbox, each one threatening heavier fines. Then, the HOA increased his fees without explanation. When he demanded answers, they shrugged. "It's standard for properties in violation," they claimed, even though his property had never been under their jurisdiction before. The neighbors, once friendly if not particularly close, suddenly avoided eye contact when they passed his house. It was as if Karen had poisoned the air, turning them against him. Then came the real betrayal. One evening, Frank was tending to Eleanor's wildflowers when he heard voices near the road. He turned just in time to see two HOA board members hammering a sign into the ground at the edge of his property. "Private property. No trespassing. HOA land. Asterisk asterisk." His stomach dropped. His land. They were claiming it as their own. Frank stormed toward them, his voice a low growl. "Get that sign off my land." The men barely glanced at him, one of them smirking. "It's not your land anymore, old man. Easement laws. You should have signed when you had the chance." A cold realization washed over him like a tidal wave. They weren't just trying to force him out. They were taking his land, right out from under him. And worse, they had the legal paperwork to back it up. Frank stood frozen as the men walked away, whistling like they hadn't just stolen a piece of his soul. He looked down at the flowers Eleanor had planted with such care, their delicate petals trembling in the evening breeze. The weight of helplessness crushed his chest. He had fought wars, stared death in the face, but he had never felt this kind of powerlessness before. The next day he went straight to his lawyer. The meeting room smelled of stale coffee and old books, the air thick with tension as Frank laid out his case. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, flipped through the documents the HOA had sent him. She frowned. "They've filed an easement claim. They're arguing that your land has always been considered common ground under the HOA's jurisdiction." Frank's hands clenched into fists. That's a lie. This land was deeded to my wife's family decades before the HOA even existed. Lisa sighed, rubbing her temples. Then we have a serious fight ahead. Easement battles are complicated. They're hoping you won't have the resources or patience to fight back. Frank's jaw tightened. He had fought for his country, fought to keep his family safe. He had never backed down from a fight in his life. But as he sat there, staring at the cold legal jargon that now dictated his fate, doubt crept in. HOA had deep pockets. They had a legal team. They had time to drown him in paperwork, to bleed him dry with legal fees. For the first time in a long time, Frank felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Eleanor's passing. Defeat. But the real devastation hadn't come yet. Happened 2 weeks later. Frank had been in town running errands when he got a frantic call from Margaret, the elderly woman who lived across the street. Her voice shook with urgency. Frank. Oh God, they're tearing it down. They're tearing down your land. His heart slammed against his ribs. He barely heard the rest before he sped home, tires screeching against the pavement. He pulled into his driveway just in time to see the worst sight of his life. Bulldozers, cranes, workers in neon vests, ripping through Eleanor's garden like it was nothing. His wife's flowers, gone, crushed under tire tracks. The wooden bench where they once sat, splintered and broken. The pond, filled with dirt. His entire world was being erased right before his eyes. He ran toward them, shouting, his voice cracking with fury and desperation. Stop! Stop this right now! One of the workers hesitated, glancing at his supervisor, but the order had already been given. The demolition continued. And there, standing smugly at the edge of the destruction, arms crossed over her chest, was Karen. Should have listened, Frank, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. But don't worry. The new HOA clubhouse will look much better here. Frank fell to his knees, his breath ragged. His soul shattered into a million pieces. They had taken everything, or so they thought. As he sat there, staring at the ruins of Eleanor's dream, something inside him shifted. The grief burned away, replaced by something deeper, stronger. They had started a war, but they had no idea who they were up against. Frank sat on the remains of his wife's wooden bench, now just a pile of splintered wood and broken memories. The once thriving garden Eleanor had planted with love was now a wasteland of tire tracks and crushed flowers. His chest tightened with grief, but grief wasn't enough anymore. No, this wasn't just about sadness anymore. This was war. Karen and her power-drunk HOA board thought they had won. They thought they could just take what wasn't theirs, crush a man's spirit, and walk away. But Frank wasn't the kind of man who stayed down. As he stared at the desolation before him, his mind wasn't dwelling on loss. It was working, calculating, plotting. If they thought he was just going to roll over and let them get away with this, they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Frank knew that HOA boards were notorious for bending the rules, but he needed proof. So, he did what any soldier in a war does. He gathered intelligence. He started digging. At first, it was just a few public records, some legal documents Lisa, his lawyer, had helped him request. But the deeper he looked, the more rotten things became. Karen and her board had been using HOA funds for personal gain, funneling money into maintenance projects that never actually happened, approving bogus fees that mysteriously ended up in their own pockets, and even bribing local officials to push through property claims that weren't legally valid. And the most damning part, the easement claim on his land was a complete fraud. They had forged signatures, manipulated county records, and filed illegal paperwork to make it seem like Frank's land had always belonged to the HOA. His hands shook as he stared at the documents in front of him. They had lied. They had stolen from him, and from every homeowner in the neighborhood. Frank's lips curled into a slow, determined smile. They thought they could bury him in bureaucracy. Now he was going to bury them. Frank had always been a quiet man. He never meddled in his neighbor's business, never attended those pointless HOA meetings. But now he needed allies. So he went door to door, knocking on every house in the neighborhood. First, people were hesitant. Karen had poisoned their ears, convinced them Frank was just a stubborn old man clinging to land that wasn't his. But then Frank started showing them the proof. One by one, their eyes widened. Homeowners who had been fined for nonsense violations, grass too long, wrong shade of shutters, unauthorized garden gnome, realized they had been scammed too. An elderly couple broke down in tears when Frank showed them how much extra money they had been forced to pay in fraudulent HOA fees. A single mother clenched her fists in fury when she saw that Karen had pocketed thousands of dollars that should have gone to fixing the neighborhood playground. Rage spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, Frank had an army. Karen and her cronies had been operating in the shadows, using legal loopholes and intimidation to keep homeowners in check. Frank knew they thrived in secrecy, so he dragged them into the light. He took the financial records and forged land documents straight to the local news. A young investigative reporter, eager to expose corruption, jumped on the story immediately. Within days, the headlines were everywhere. Local HOA president accused of fraud and land theft. Neighbors unite against HOA scandal. Victimized homeowner uncovers illegal HOA operation. The news exploded across social media. Homeowners from all over the city rallied behind Frank, sharing their own horror stories of HOA abuse. The pressure on Karen intensified. People started demanding answers. Her phone rang non-stop. City officials who once ignored Frank's complaints suddenly started asking questions. And then came the best part, a full-scale legal investigation into the HOA's finances. Frank had set the wheels in motion, and there was no stopping them now. Karen was losing control and she knew it. So she did what cowards always do. She tried to run. Late one night, she called an emergency HOA meeting, trying to sell off as much of the association's assets as possible before the legal investigation froze their funds. But what she didn't know was that Frank had insider information. One of the board members, scared of going down with a sinking ship, had leaked their plan to him. So, when the HOA office building and Frank's stolen land went up for sale, Frank bought them both. The moment Karen realized what had happened, her face went ghost white. "You," she stammered, her voice shaking with rage. "You can't do this." Frank leaned in, his voice calm but deadly. "You took my land," he said. "Now I own yours." The look of pure horror on her face was worth every penny. Frank didn't just win. He made a statement. Instead of tearing down the old HOA office, he turned it into a free community space. A sanctuary for everyone who had been abused by Karen and her board. The land that had once been his wife's peaceful garden. He restored it. He rebuilt the bench, replanted the wildflowers, and invited every homeowner to enjoy it, free of HOA interference forever. Karen. She was arrested. The remaining HOA members, terrified of facing serious jail time, turned on her in court, testifying against her in exchange for reduced sentences. HOA itself was dissolved. Frank had done more than just get revenge. He had freed an entire neighborhood from corruption. And as he sat on the new wooden bench, watching the sun set over the land he had fought so hard to reclaim, he felt something he hadn't in years. Eleanor would have been proud. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting a golden glow over Frank's newly reclaimed land. Where there had once been destruction and chaos, now stood hope and resilience. The wildflowers had been replanted, bright yellows, purples, and reds swaying gently in the wind. The pond, once filled with dirt by the HOA's bulldozers, now shimmered under the evening light, with smooth stones placed along its edge, each stone hand-painted by a neighbor with messages of unity and defiance. But the true heart of this land was the new wooden bench. It wasn't just any bench. It was an exact replica of the one his wife, Eleanor, had once built. Every plank was sanded smooth, every nail carefully hammered in, and on the backrest, Frank had carved a simple yet powerful message. For Eleanor, and for everyone who refuses to be silenced. The neighbors gathered that evening, no longer bound by the fear Karen and her HOA board had once instilled in them. There was a quiet strength in the air, a sense of community reborn from the ashes of tyranny. Children played by the pond, elders admired the wildflowers, and for the first time in years, people weren't whispering about HOA fines or hidden fees. They were free. But the battle wasn't completely over yet. Karen, despite her public humiliation, wasn't the type to go down without a final, desperate swing. 1 week after the land was restored, Frank heard the familiar screech of tires outside his property. He didn't even have to turn his head to know who it was. Karen. She stood at the edge of the land, arms crossed, eyes burning with a venomous glare. Gone was her perfectly curated image of the HOA queen. Her hair was frazzled, her usual smug smirk replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. She looked like a woman on the edge, a dictator without a kingdom. Frank calmly placed a watering can by the wildflowers and strolled over, keeping his voice steady. "Something I can help you with, Karen?" he asked, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Her nostrils flared. This circus you've created, it won't last," she hissed. "You think you've won. You think buying a plot of dirt and turning it into some pathetic memorial is a victory." Frank's smile didn't waver. "It's not just a memorial, Karen. It's a reminder, to me, to this community, of what happens when people like you abuse power." Her voice trembled with fury. "You're ruining this neighborhood. This place needs order, it needs structure. Without the HO, it's going to fall apart." Frank took a step closer, his voice lowering to a calm, firm tone. "The only thing that fell apart was your stranglehold over these people. The only thing broken was the way you bled this community dry while pretending to care about it." Karen's jaw clenched so hard, he could almost hear her teeth grinding. "You'll regret this," she spat. "You'll regret ever crossing me." Frank let the silence hang in the air for a moment before he chuckled softly. "I think the only person with regrets here is you, Karen." And with that, he turned his back on her, something she wasn't used to. She wasn't the one in control anymore. Karen stormed off, but this time, there was no army of HOA board members following behind her. She was alone. And the neighborhood, they were just getting started. In the following days, Frank's land evolved into something greater than he ever imagined. The community, once fractured and fearful, now worked together to build something beautiful. A small wooden gazebo was erected by the pond, built by the very same neighbors who had once cowered under Karen's rule. A few local artists painted murals along the fence line, bright, bold artwork symbolizing freedom, unity, and strength. Then came the moment that sealed Karen's fate forever. At a community gathering, Frank made an announcement that sent a ripple of stunned silence through the crowd, before it erupted into cheers. He wasn't just stopping at his land. He had filed the paperwork to officially dissolve the HOA. Karen's reign was over. Permanently. There would be no more secret fees, no more ridiculous fines for a mailbox being 2 inches too tall, no more threats disguised as compliance letters. The neighborhood was free, not just from Karen, but from the entire corrupt system that had allowed her to thrive in the first place. And to twist the knife even deeper, Frank revealed that the old HOA office, the very building Karen once ruled from, was now repurposed into a community center called Eleanor's Garden Hall, a place where neighbors could gather, not to be judged but to connect, a place where children would laugh instead of hide their toys from HOA patrols, a place where people finally belonged. The final blow to Karen's crumbling legacy came when the news station followed up on the story, highlighting the transformation from a dictatorship under Karen to a flourishing community without her. Karen refused every interview request, a shell of the power-hungry woman she once was. Frank never saw her again after that. Rumor had it, she sold her house and moved to another town. Some even whispered that she tried to join another HOA but was quickly voted out after her reputation caught up with her. And as for Frank, he spent his evenings sitting on the new wooden bench, Eleanor's bench, watching the sun set over the wildflowers, the pond rippling gently, and the community he had fought so hard to save. One evening, as the sky burned with shades of pink and orange, his neighbor Margaret sat beside him. She patted his hand softly and smiled. "You did it, Frank," she whispered. "You didn't just take back your land. You gave all of us our lives back." Frank smiled, a tear sliding down his cheek, not from sadness, but from the quiet, peaceful joy of knowing that his fight wasn't just for himself. It was for Eleanor. It was for his neighbors.